Welcome and thank you to our panelists for accepting the invitation from the Hub to join today's discussion regarding the quality of life and affordability of Detroit's neighborhoods. I'm Jackie Berg, the founder and publisher of the Hub. We're a hyper-local news source that delivers news, blogs, videos, and original content about Detroit's neighborhoods. Given local reporters' focus on the people, places, and plans that are changing and transforming the city, we think that there's no better time to start the dialogue about what's happening in Detroit's neighborhoods and including its residents in those conversations regarding development in the city. First, I'd like to welcome all of our esteemed panelists, but particularly Maurice Jones. For those of you who do not know, he has served as Virginia's Secretary of Commerce and Trade and was second in command at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So this is a great opportunity to get perspective, from national leadership. And he is currently LISC President and CEO. So this man brings money, influence, and understanding to Detroit, and we're so happy to have you here. In addition, we're being joined to my right by Tahir Ziegler, the Executive Director of Detroit LISC, who is also no stranger to conversations regarding the quality of life and affordability issues here in Detroit. She manages them daily and beautifully, and we're so pleased to have her. We're also going to hear from Tom Gaddis to my very right. And although Tom's official title is the Executive Director of Grandmont Rosedale Development Corporation, he's also informally recognized as one of the godfathers, if you will, of neighborhood stabilization and business attraction efforts, as well as an ardent community champion. So we welcome you, Tom. And finally, if there was a godfather, there's also a godmother here in this community, and that is Maggie DeSantis, the initiative manager of Building the Engine, which is a new partnership aimed at spurring neighborhood-based economic development in the city. Many of us know Maggie for her longtime role as president and CEO of the Eastside Community Network, which was originally founded under the Warren Connor Development Coalition. So, just before we get started, these guys are tireless, and they get more done before breakfast than most of us do in an entire day. And again, we want to be able to keep up with your news and information, your leadership, and your understanding of what it is that needs to be done to make sure that we move development forward in a way that is very impactful and beneficial to Detroit's residents, meaning you should prosper by development that's happening here in the city. So we're happy to go ahead and start the conversation. So the first question is open to any of our panelists who would care to comment, and probably not surprisingly, it begins with the issue of gentrification. It's a big topic, here in the city. We hear an awful lot about the True Detroits. And it's been said that it's a good problem to have on one hand because it's a sign of rebirth and new development in neighborhoods that have been long neglected. So the question is, what can and are organizations like yours doing to ensure that development does not cause undue stress and displacement on the lowest income residents and businesses? And in your answer, please address the situation faced by low-income individuals and families, many of whom are seniors living on very low and fixed incomes. So would any of the panelists like to take that first?
Hello, everyone. I will do my best to take a stab at it, and I'm really going to come at it from two perspectives. One is that it just so happens that I live in one of the neighborhoods that's now known as a hot neighborhood. And in the space of 2 years, my home has gone from being totally underwater to now being valued at almost 3 times what the appraised value was a few years ago. I'm in shock over it, but what I'm more in shock over, and I know this is true a lot because my daughter tells me, she is away at college, and when she comes home, she notices how the neighborhood is changing. And she's actually, so I'm busy being glad that the value of my home has gone up. I'm in shock at how the demographics of the neighborhood are changing. And I'm hearing my daughter say, when I come home permanently from college, I'm not living here because the neighborhood has changed in a way that I'm not comfortable with. My daughter is a young African-American woman who plans to make her career in life in Detroit. So, so in West Village, we see something like gentrification happening. When I put on my professional community developer hat, though, it gets more complicated. And for me, the irony and the complication of talking about gentrification in Detroit is that typically you see that happening in cities where space is very limited, right? Smaller cities where the demand for quality housing and space outstrips the supply. And we often see it in the coastal cities or just the cities with a smaller footprint. Here we are sitting in Detroit, 140 square miles, space galore, am I right? And a couple of neighborhoods are now in the process of flipping in the way that I just described my own neighborhood. And there's something wrong with that picture. So how does a city that has abundant space, available space, begin to experience this kind of negative gentrification in a couple of different neighborhoods? I have my own theories about it. Some of my friends are familiar with them, and if you put me on a soapbox, it'll take too long. But I think we are not paying enough attention to the kind of markets we could be paying attention to, just in terms of potential residents who we could be targeting. So we've sliced off a segment of the population that's clearly more interested in the kind of neighborhoods that are gentrifying here in the city. The the young 20-something hipster segment of the population, renters, et cetera. And they're going to be interested in a certain neighborhood, and those neighborhoods are now filling up, and demand is outstripping available space. And I think if we don't broaden our vision, recognize that there are any number of other kinds of target populations, if you will, who we could be providing space for, we're going to be in trouble. So what about low-income people who either don't live here now or might find Detroit a good place to live? What about the fact that in many neighborhoods there might be housing available, but it's not quality housing? How can we make quality space available? How can we recognize that huge amounts of subsidy are going to be required for that?
So I think that, Mr. Jones, I know that you have something to say about that, because you've seen models across the country, some of whom are somewhat similar to Detroit, although we'd like to consider ourselves unique, and some of which are very different and moving much more quickly. And in talking prior to the panel, you explained to me that there's something to learn about that. What would you say?
So I would say, if you look at this issue of gentrification and displacement nationally, that you see a number of places that are finding ways to manage it. So for example, in Washington, D.C., which has neighborhoods that are gentrifying in several places, we are there. LISC is working with neighborhood groups, CDCs, with residents to actually buy their properties. So, and this is co-ops as well as houses, so that they can be owners and take advantage of the property value increases as they happen. And that is an opportunity, I think, here as well as other places. We're doing a similar thing in Philadelphia, where you have, frankly, you have students moving into housing near universities, and the rents are just going through the roof. And so there are community groups that are banding together, and we're providing financing and technical assistance and trying to aggregate other resources so that folks can buy the land, buy the properties.
So what can we do now to make that happen tomorrow in Detroit?
I think I will leave this to the local groups here.
Well, I think that we have a long road to go. We have to think about this very intentional in terms of the policies that we'd like to see at the city level, in terms of seeing some models across the country. DC is a great example of that, in terms of trying to figure out if there is opportunity for tenants to really look at properties. And what I mean by that is there is an issue here in Midtown where there are a lot of senior properties, and those particular properties are owned by private owners, property owners. And they may choose to maybe go to market rate. So I think there has to be some policies in terms of can the tenants buy the property? Are there some low interest loans that can help them? Can they organize? And then also for those property owners, are there incentives that we can figure out either at the state or federal level that will keep those places affordable and keep those landowners interested in affordability to preserve those units?
Just chime in on that. So look at DC. DC has something on the books called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And that has facilitated our being able to organize the tenants there and help tenants purchase co-ops, purchase housing. It may be that what you need here is something akin to that kind of legislation to help groups actually work with tenants. But the bottom line is cities are doing this. There are models out there. I refer you to DC, but I can tell you DC's doing this. I can tell you Philly's doing it, Boston. I mean, the interesting thing is this issue of gentrification tends to be more of an issue on the East Coast and the West Coast. So Detroit's having it is believe it or not, a promising sign, but you got to manage it, right? You can't be agnostic about it. There are data points when you can tell when a community is about to experience gentrification. But there are tools like this that I think could be very helpful at a place like Detroit.
And then, Tom, obviously you've done much in Grandmont Rosedale in terms of attracting new residents and a diversity of residents. So do you have a different take on that?
Well, our community is a little unique, I think, in the sense that it is a very mixed income neighborhood. And in part, that's not so much because high income people are moving in and bidding up the prices as we're able to hold on to our residents whose income increases and they don't immediately decide that they need to move out of our neighborhood and into some other location. So part of we consider ourselves a neighborhood of choice, which means that people are choosing to live there based on the quality of life that they can find there and not strictly on the price point of a home. At the same time, our organization is really a coalition of 5 neighborhoods, and it covers a large area, about 5,700 houses. And we have deliberately tried to cultivate this notion that we're all in it together. So within those 5 neighborhoods, there's a wide range of housing. You can buy a 800 square foot 2-bedroom home, or you can buy a 3,200 square foot, I wouldn't call them mansions, but historic home. And so within that whole community, there are different price points, and there are always going to be. And we try to get residents to be working together in organization across neighborhoods, regardless of whether they live in that historic mansion or they live in the 800 square foot home. And I think that's really helped us to maintain stability within the community.
The foundation and funding community has stepped up in a tremendous way in Detroit over the past few years with its commitment to the Grand Bargain as a key element of Detroit's emergence out of bankruptcy, and in making funding commitments to targeted neighborhoods over a sustained period of time. The question is, please speak to the priorities funders have when investing in neighborhoods and the key indicators of what a good neighborhood looks like. And some people have called that now a neighborhood index. And my curiosity is do we need one? Is it going to be helpful, and how far away from that is that coming into fruition?
Well, over the last several years, different funders have had different priorities. So some large foundations have invested in very low-income communities. Others have taken a more of the focus that we need to build from strength. So there hasn't really been, I'd say, a single way of approaching that. A lot of resources obviously have gone down into the downtown, midtown neighborhood, to some near downtown neighborhoods. And those are the funders who are really seeing that build from strength strategy. But it hasn't been consistent. I think there's been a lot of other funders who have different focus on children, focus on social services, who have spread money to other places. I'm not familiar with the neighborhood index. I'm curious, though, to find out about it.
Well, in terms of the neighborhood index, I'm not that familiar either, but I do know that in terms of our work with building sustainable communities, and we have 5 targeted neighborhoods across the city, we have neighborhood indicators. And those neighborhood indicators really come from our national office, our research office, in terms of really looking, engaging neighborhood kind of trends, where neighborhoods have been over the past 10 years. And we're really looking at 110 neighborhoods across the country. And so being able to compare Detroit's neighborhoods to those neighborhoods, we're not that different from some of those neighborhoods and some of the issues that we're dealing with. But we're tracking things like mortgage kind of approvals, we're tracking unemployment, we're tracking income. We're tracking a whole range of indicators to kind of show the metrics of where neighborhoods are improving.
So some of the work that I've been doing recently through an effort called Building the Engine of Community Development in Detroit has been really trying to wrestle with the whole question of what is success for our neighborhoods. The 2 people on the end there, Tahir and Tom, have both been involved in this process, and the call has been for us to develop a system only after we figure out what we think a successful neighborhood is. So actually for the past several months, there's been a lot of work being done around those questions. And yesterday at a fairly large convening of the 100 plus organizations that have been involved in this process, there was actually consensus around one single most important indicator of success for neighborhoods.
I'm stunned, a consensus.
Well, it was 65 people. That's a pretty small number, but it was a reflection of, I think, a very, very deep discussion. So the debate during the process was, are the only successful neighborhoods those that are very dense, where the turnover is very low, where the real estate market is thriving, or what about neighborhoods where neighbors are organized and they're together, but there might be a lot of blight? And out of that debate has emerged one overarching success measure, which is actually social cohesion, which can happen in a neighborhood where there might be 2 houses on 25 blocks per block, or a neighborhood like Grandmont Rosedale. There's a lot of work nationally that's been done to define social cohesion. And then the group came up with 4 other types of neighborhood indicators, 2 related to whether or not the community process is moving forward, and 2 related to what the condition of the neighborhood is. And success becomes not so much a fixed data point, 80% occupancy, 20% turnover, so much as it is indications of progress. So is poverty going down? Are there fewer and fewer unmanaged vacant properties? Do neighbors have a growing feeling of safety? Is there a growing belief that neighbors can plug in and have an influence on their neighborhood? It's really tremendous work that's gone on. And I think in Detroit, we've been the leader in a whole lot of good and bad trends. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to have to invent the right kind of measures for our neighborhoods, because there are too many neighborhoods that are ravaged, and we know it. Let's tell the truth. Not enough neighborhoods that fit the traditional definition of good neighborhood. And we've got to really dig deep and recognize that successful neighborhoods start with how people feel and whether they are organized. And I think that's a really forward thinking. So Tahir and Tom, thank you. You contributed to that.
Excellent. And Mr. Jones, I saw you taking quite a few notes, and I wondered if you had some comments on that.
Only that it's consistent with, what we're seeing across the country when people are trying to define what a healthy neighborhood, a healthy community is. There's a health theme, right? There's a jobs and wages theme. There's a housing theme. There's a community safety theme. I mean, these are, and to the point made, there's also, we're seeing arts more and more become part of the conversation. And we're also seeing more and more, not just housing and affordable housing, but healthy housing, right? Housing where the, if you will, risk to health are being eliminated. Right? Those are all the kinds of things. And then this issue of the empowerment of the folks in that neighborhood to make decisions and determine the destiny of their neighborhoods. All of that seems to be at work. I left out recreation, but that's also at work. Those are the kinds of themes that we're seeing, that we're being asked to help communities work on, improve, move along, if you will, a continuum of excellence when people are defining what's a healthy, resilient, desirable community.
So one thing that's happened in the last couple of years is we have a new administration, and they are becoming more proactive I've been in community development for 25 years, and this is, I'd say, the most proactive I've seen in the planning function in the city, for example. And now we have a Department of Neighborhoods where there are individuals within each council district who are working on building that community cohesion and identifying block clubs. And that has really helped our work in terms of increasing communication and collaboration, not only within our neighborhood as the service area that we serve, but with neighboring communities. And in District 1, at least, we have a great deal of neighborhood, cross-neighborhood collaboration and communication. And so I think that what's the sort of missing piece is to increasing that communication between those neighborhoods and the city and the foundations and getting everybody on the same page. I think we're moving in that direction, but we really haven't gotten there yet.
I think actually most everybody understands the power of the resident voice. That is not the problem. The problem is whether we recognize what it really takes to lift it up, organize it, unify it. And very often, what I see is, and I think even foundations acknowledge this, is that we don't recognize that it costs time and money for resident voice to be organized and lifted up. And so I know yesterday, again, a lot of the discussions were about the time and resources it takes to support the amazing work that's going on in neighborhoods by volunteers, and the importance of community development organizations being resourced in order to be that intermediary that can help resident voice as it comes through block clubs and neighborhood associations and business associations, et cetera. So it takes time, it takes resources, and we've got to recognize it. And there's been a proposal on the table, it was just put on the table yesterday, to actually organize that system formally through local neighborhood roundtables that are then convened citywide regularly, where professional facilitators help that conversation along and lift the conversation up in a way that's more strategic and more able to be heard by the city and by foundations. So I think the foundation's intentions are there, absolutely.
Let me just add to this. There is, and I'm so delighted you're doing this, there's also a key role that the media must play. The media must cover the stories of folks who are in our neighborhoods, who are getting up every day, playing by the rules, working hard, trying to do what's right for their families. We need to tell their stories. I'm a former publisher of a newspaper, so these are stories that are there if you now in the media world goes and get them, right? It's easier for us to cover, for the media to cover stories that just sort of come to us, right? Corruption in government or what have you. But the stories that are out there of the ordinary person every day in this neighborhood, working hard to try to improve their lives and the lives of the neighborhood, we need to give voice to that. And the media is a powerful, powerful piece of the story if they tell the stories. And so I want to thank you for what you're doing here today. I also want to invite the media to think about their responsibility and their opportunity to get more of these stories across print, across social media, across radio, television. That is as powerful a way as any in giving voice to the folks that we're trying to help give voice to.
Excellent. So with that, I'm going to close out the conversation today. I thank all of the panelists for participating. It's an important start to the conversation, but it's certainly not the end. And so with that, the Hub will be featuring a series of panel discussions in our next round, including more neighborhood residents in the dialogue, because again, we really feel that it's important that your voice be elevated in the conversation about your neighborhood and what's happening in the local community. Particularly one of the areas of focus that we are playing a role on, in addition to covering neighborhood groups and economic development, is small business development in Detroit's neighborhoods. And we're really proud of that, because that's an important part about what makes our community livable and worth coming home to, and walking into a place of business and having somebody know your name. Just an incredible development. And so with that, I did want to thank Comcast, who is sponsoring our Small Shops series, which is focusing on small, locally owned businesses in neighborhoods. Not that we don't love our midtown and downtown businesses, we absolutely do, and we applaud all the new entrants that have come into the market. But there are many minority-owned businesses here across the city that don't get near the attention, nor, quite frankly, the traffic that they should. And so we really consider it a part of our role to help to change that. So Comcast Business has been involved in helping us to elevate that conversation and do some important things in the neighborhood. We're also, as I said, going to be continuing this series of conversations. Maurice Cox, our planning director, has already promised to be involved in the next conversation, so we're very excited about that, to get his input in regard to how he sees some of the dialogue that happened here today, and how he'd like to move some of those conversations forward. And just in closing, I'd like to thank Comcast, and I'm really being very genuine about this, because these partnerships, we're a big, at the Hub, we're a big believer in collaborative partnerships. We have relationships with minority media publishers and other media outlets to try to elevate, as you said, the conversation about Detroit's neighborhoods. But we also have corporates, partners that help us to bring forward those sort of programs. And Comcast, from the very beginning of the formation of the Hub, has been there, and whenever we've asked, they've said yes. And I think it's really important to recognize that, because this costs them. And what we get back in terms of community dividends is really priceless. So, I'd like to thank them. And then it's important to thank you, the audience, for coming out today, for listening, and hopefully taking back some of what you hear and integrating it into some of your local community plans. I've heard some things that I wasn't aware of, so you always learn something new when you come out to these sort of events. But at the end of the day, we all want to make Detroit a better place to come home to and have more viable neighborhoods in our community. And if we can play a role in that, we definitely want to do that. So thank you so much for coming out. Feel free to continue the conversation. And again, come back to us because we're going to continue these panel conversations and your voice will get heard. Rest assured. Thank you so much.